Hi, welcome to Give Cheese a Chance, where I encourage you to make cheese at home. I'm Marianne. Can you imagine mixing a camembert cheese with a blue cheese? What would you get? You'd probably be eating what's known as a Cambozola. That word comes from two different cheeses. The first part comes from camembert, and the second part comes from gorgonzola, which is a blue cheese. Now, if you're not crazy about blue cheeses, don't worry. I have so many friends who aren't crazy about blue cheese, but when they try this Cambozola recipe, they are pleasantly surprised, and it becomes one of their favorites. Of all the cheeses that I've made, it's my favorite as well. So take a chance on making this recipe. You'll be pleasantly surprised at how good it comes out and how delicious it is. So let me show you how I make this Cambozola style cheese at home. Let's go. To start this recipe by adding 2 gallons or 8 liters of cow's milk to a very large pot. And I am using pasteurized milk today. You can use raw milk if you have access to it, that's great, but I'm using pasteurized milk, and I'm also using unhomogenized milk, which I highly recommend. Unhomogenized milk will give you the perfect camembert ooey gooey texture that you want in your final cheese. So if you use a homogenized milk, you're going to find you don't get that right texture, and when you cut the curds in the pot, those curds will have a tendency to shatter or break up into little pieces, and you don't want that. So again, really look for unhomogenized cow's milk, full fat for this recipe. And to this milk, we are going to add some whipping cream. This is about 1 liter or 2 pints. And the reason that we're adding this whipping cream is we want to increase the fat content of this milk so that we get a cheese that's almost like a double or triple cream brie. It's going to be nice and luscious when you eat it. So we're really just using this for the fat content. So let's add it to our milk. Let's heat this milk slowly and very gently over low heat over a 15 to 20 minute period until the temperature comes to about 86 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Celsius. Make sure that you stir this milk as it is heating so that the temperature of the milk is consistent throughout the entire pot. When you use non-homogenized milk, you may find that there are little bits of butter that are floating around in the milk, and that's okay. While the milk is heating, I'm going to take a pH reading with my pH meter, which I've already calibrated. I'm going to put my pH meter directly into the milk and record the pH of this milk. The pH reader is showing that the pH of this milk is now 6.7, and I'm going to write that down on my log sheet to keep track. So we've hit our target temperature. It's time to turn off the heat. And we're going to add our starter bacteria to the milk. Add 1/8 of a teaspoon of MM100, and it's going to do 2 things. First of all, it's going to give a rich, buttery flavor to the cheese, and second of all, it's going to create an open texture within the cheese. And we want an open texture so that the blue mold spores that we add to the inside of the cheese will have some cracks and crevices to grow. And I'm going to magnify those cracks and crevices by adding an optional ingredient. So if you don't have this next ingredient, don't worry, you can still make this cheese great. This optional ingredient is called leuconostoc mesentoroids, and it really will magnify the open texture inside the cheese, so we will get even more blue mold growing inside. So we're going to add 1/4 teaspoon of leuconostoc mesentoroid and let these 2 ingredients sit on the surface of the milk for about 1 minute before mixing them in. And while you're waiting that 1 minute, you can prepare your calcium chloride solution. Measure out 1/4 teaspoon of 33% calcium chloride into a 1/4 cup of non-chlorinated water and stir. I'm going to take that calcium chloride solution and add it to my milk and stir everything together. You'll need to stir for about a minute to incorporate everything throughout the entire pot. And now that everything is thoroughly mixed, I'm going to put a lid on the pot and let it sit there for 1 hour undisturbed. I'll see you in an hour. So it's time to add our rennet to the milk. To make a rennet mixture, dilute 1/4 teaspoon of double strength liquid rennet into 1/4 cup of non-chlorinated water and stir. I have my rennet here. I'm going to pour it into the milk and mix for 1 minute. We want the rennet to coagulate the milk so that it will be turned into a firm curd over the next 90 minutes. So now that I have mixed the milk, I'm going to put the lid back on and let this pot sit undisturbed for 90 minutes. The 90-minute timer is up. Let's see if we have a good curd set, or what we call a clean break. You can see that there is a layer of butter fat on the top, and that's because I used unhomogenized milk. So if you have that in your pot, don't worry about it. It's all part of the cheese making process. I'm going to use my knife here just to check the curd by making a little cut and trying to open it up and see if there is a good separation of the curd, and there is. So I'm going to cut my curd into cubes that are about 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch in dimension. And then in the other direction at a 90-degree angle. And now some diagonal cuts. Now that I have cut the curd into cubes, I'm going to let them heal for about 5 minutes. The next step is to stir our curds very gently over a 15-minute period. And I'm using a long spatula, which I'm going to just run along the inside of the pot, just to separate the curds at first. This process of stirring is actually drawing out moisture from our curds. Our 15-minute timer is now up, so it's time to stop stirring and let the curds sit for about 5 minutes. The curds should start to settle towards the bottom of the pot. I brought my pot over to my sink, and if you look inside the pot, there is a lot of liquid whey on the top because the curds have settled to the bottom. So I'm going to use a strainer and a large ladle to remove all of that liquid whey that's at the top of the pot. I have set up 2 strainers in my other sink with some pre-sterilized fabric that is laid over the top of them. And I'm going to drain my curds by filling these strainers. The goal is to put more or less dry curds into my forms. So my strainers have now been completely filled, and I can hear a lot of liquid draining into the sink underneath. I'm going to let these drain for about 20 minutes, and halfway through, I'm going to come by and just lift up the corners of the fabric, just to encourage more draining. So I'll see you in about 20 minutes. These curds have now been draining for about 20 minutes. It's time to transfer them to our cylindrical forms. And I have a large Brie-shaped form, and I have one that is a camembert-shaped form. You can do only camembert-shaped forms if you want. You'll have 5 smaller cambozolas, or you can do a mixture, which is what I'm doing, so that I'll have some triangular Brie-shaped cambozolas at the end and one smaller cambozola. I don't know, I like the variety. So I'm going to use my large ladle and make a base layer in the bottom of both of these forms. It'll be about 1 inch thick. And I want to make sure that the curds are more or less separated from each other as I'm adding them to the form. And now that I have my base layer made, I have a small packet of Penicillium roqueforti spores, which I'm hoping are going to germinate in this very moist and oxygenated environment, and they're going to grow this delicious blue mold that we love with blue cheese. So I'm going to open my packet and put in the tip of a knife. So this is a very small knife, and I want very small amounts of these Penicillium roqueforti spores to be sprinkled into the very center of both of our forms. It's going to look like a sprinkling of black pepper. I don't need a lot. And now I'm going to put a second layer of curds on top. And another layer on the smaller form. And some more Penicillium roqueforti as well, a second layer. That is a very small amount of blue mold spores that I'm adding. And finally, we're going to add curds to create the top layer of our cheeses. It's important that these cheeses get flipped 5 times over the next 12 hours or overnight. So let's do our first flip. It's very easy to flip a cheese that has a hard bottom like this. Let's do that one first. I have a large Japanese style sushi mat. I'm going to place it on top. I'm going to pick up the entire mold and flip it and place it on top of my roasting rack here. This roasting rack will allow all of this draining whey to accumulate at the bottom of this dish. And I can see already there's quite a lot of liquid in the tray. There will be much more by tomorrow morning when we come and check on this cheese. So it's a little bit more challenging to flip a mold like this, which doesn't have a bottom. I do have this mat underneath the cheese. Put a very thin board right underneath the mat. Cover this small mold with another piece of this firm netting and put another cardboard on the top. Pick the whole thing up and flip the cheese. Both of these cheeses will reduce in thickness overnight, and they will continue to drip more moisture into the roasting pan underneath. So now all I have to do is continue to flip these every few hours over the next 12 hours or so, and then I'll come back tomorrow morning and check in with you. Good morning, everyone. It's now the next morning. It's day 2 of our cheese project, and we're going to do a few things today. First of all, I'm going to flip my cheese one more time. Go. They look beautiful, and I want to show you the amount of liquid that has drained from these cheeses overnight. So I'll remove the top tray. Wow, that's quite a lot of liquid that was in our cheese yesterday, even after we pre-drained it. So I'm going to dump it. Remember when we started this cheese making project, we took a pH reading of our milk and it was at 6.7 approximately. So it's important to check the pH at this point of our cheese making process. We want the goal pH now to be about 4.8 or in that general area. So let's take a pH reading directly of our curd here. I have my pH meter, which I have already calibrated, and I'm going to stick it directly into the curd. 4.85, that's great. It's now time to move on to salting our cheeses. We want the salt concentration in our final cheese to be 2%, but we're going to measure out a little more than that, actually 2.5%, to account for salt loss. Let's weigh the cheeses first. The small cheese is about 392 grams. And the large cheese is about 1,472 grams. Now we can do the math. I take the weight of the small cheese, 392 grams, and multiply it by 0.025. That equals 10 grams. I need 10 grams of salt to coat the entire surface of the small cheese. For the larger cheese, I take the weight, 1,472 grams, and multiply it by 0.025, and that equals 37 grams. I need 37 grams of salt to be applied to the entire surface of the large cheese. And now that I have both of my salt bowls ready to go, I'm going to sprinkle half of the salt on the tops. And rub it in. I don't know why this is such a satisfying thing to do, but I enjoy rubbing the salt on the cheeses. And you can apply some salt to the sides as well. So it's been a couple of hours now, and I'm going to flip each cheese and apply the rest of the salt to the other side. Look at all the salt that is left on my fingers. This is one of the reasons that we measure out more salt than what we really need, because if we only measured out 2% of salt, then we wouldn't be applying the full 2% to the surface of the cheese. Since I don't want my cheeses to be wet at the end of the day, sometimes I use a fan to help dry the surface of the cheeses. This also prevents something called slip skin, which happens sometimes when the surface of the cheeses are too wet. It's been a few hours now that my cheeses have been salted, and it's time to put them into their ripening box. This is just a very large plastic bucket, and on the bottom there is a tray that will allow air to make contact with the bottom of the cheeses, and it will also allow any moisture to drip away from the cheeses. On top of this tray, I have a bamboo sushi mat, which you can use, or another piece of this plastic netting. Either are fine. I'm going to transfer my cheeses into the bucket. Any moisture that accumulates at the bottom of this box must be wiped away with a paper towel. You do not want a wet environment around these cheeses. You want a humid environment. And if you're having trouble creating a humid environment in this box, you can always take a paper towel, scrunch it up, soak it with some water, and put it in the corner of your box, and that will add some humidity. So I'm going to cover this box, but not tightly. I'm going to keep the lid of the box askew so that air can go into the box and circulate around the cheeses. And I'm going to put this box in my basement cold room right now, which is at the ideal temperature of 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That is really the temperature that you want when you're maturing these cheeses. But we're not just going to leave them there. We're coming back tomorrow and the next day to do 2 interesting steps, and I will show you tomorrow. It's now day 3, and I've brought up my ripening bucket from my basement cold room. Today, we're going to do a couple of interesting things. First, let's remind ourselves that we are making a Cambozola, which is a combination cheese of a camembert and a blue cheese. We've already added the blue spores, the Penicillium roqueforti, to the inside of the cheese. But with a camembert, we want to also have a white mold exterior. So how do we accomplish that? I have found when making Cambozola at home that timing is everything. I've found that I have to pierce the inside of this cheese on day 3, and I have to add the white mold spores, the Penicillium candidum and the Geotrichum candidum, on day 4. Why is the timing important? Because if I allow the blue mold spores to reach the sides of this cheese and to take over the surface of this cheese, then they will be in competition with the white mold spores that I want on the outside, and it won't give me a snowy white coat. And if I allow the opposite to happen, if I allow the white mold spores to take over the coat, and then I try to pierce the cheese to bring oxygen to the inside to allow the blue mold spores to grow, well, what happens is the white mold spores will close up the holes that I create. So again, timing is really important. So today is day 3. We're going to pierce our cheese. I have a knitting needle here, which is a metal knitting needle. It happens to be size number 5 for any of you knitters out there. I have already boiled it in some water to sterilize it, and I'm going to use this knitting needle to make horizontal holes throughout the cheese. I don't want to use a needle that is too thin. What I have found in the past is if the needle is too thin, for example, like a barbecue skewer, then the cheese will just collapse upon itself and the air will not penetrate into the cheese. So make sure there's a little bit of girth to your needle here. And if you try and pierce this cheese earlier, for example, yesterday, the cheese will still be too soft and it will collapse the holes that you create. So again, stick to the timeline. Pierce on day 3. I'm going to go as deep as I can, trying not to penetrate through the other side. If I do, that's okay. I find that if I penetrate the other side, sometimes I create such a gap in the middle that the top part of the cheese lifts off. And if that happens to you, don't worry, you will still get a gorgeous cheese. Look at this Cambozola cheese that I made when I really went to town over piercing it because I wanted a lot of blue mold on the inside. It made an amazing effect. You'll get better and better in time as you pierce the cheese more. And I also pierce the cheese on 2 different levels. The cheese is thick enough to be able to handle 2 holes on top of each other. Let me just show you how I do this. I'm going to go around the entire cheese and make these piercings. I do some on the lower level and some a little bit higher. So now I'm bringing oxygen into the center of the cheese. This blue mold needs oxygen to grow. And now that I've pierced this cheese, it's going to go back into the ripening box. And it's time to pierce our smaller cheese with the same method. And the more holes you make in the cheese, the more channels or airflow there will be on the inside of the cheese, the more blue mold you'll have. So if you like a lot of blue mold flavor, like I do, then pierce it more. Now we have given the blue mold a little head start over the white mold spores that we're going to be adding to the cheese surfaces tomorrow. For this recipe, we need 50 milliliters of non-chlorinated water added to a small bowl. Add 1/16 of a teaspoon of Geotrichum candidum spores. I'm using version number 13. I find it works the best. I'm going to clean my spoon. And 1/16 of a teaspoon, the same amount, of Penicillium candidum, which is going to give that beautiful white coat that we love on our camemberts. I'm going to take the same amount and put it into our little bowl here. Mix it up and let it sit overnight with a little bit of plastic wrap on the surface. Please don't be tempted to apply this solution of our 2 white fungal spores to the surface of our cheese this day. It really does have to sit overnight and then be applied on the next day if you want the best result for the outside white coat of your cheese. You're just not going to get the right result. It's going to be very spotty if you apply it today. So this is going to go into my fridge overnight. I'm going to put this bucket back into my basement cold room, which is still at 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and I will see you tomorrow where I'm going to show you how I apply this solution to the surface of the cheese. It's now day 4, and all we have to do today is take the solution that we made yesterday, grab a piece of cheesecloth and soak it into the solution, and we get our cheeses, checking that the holes are still open, and they are. They look amazing. And I'm just going to rub the cheesecloth that now has picked up the white mold spores that we added. Going to rub it all over the cheese. This way we're inoculating the surface of the cheese with those 2 white mold spores that we added yesterday, the Geotrichum candidum and the Penicillium candidum. And I'm going to do the sides. And the other side. And that's all you need to do to inoculate the surface of your cheese. It's amazing how just doing this will cause the white mold spores to germinate and take over the surface of your cheese. And now that I've done that, all I want to do is to take this ripening box into my basement cold room where it's 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's going to stay there for the next few weeks. I am going to flip these cheeses every day, and I'm going to notice that the white mold spores will germinate and spread their beautiful microscopic branches across the surface of the cheese. When the cheeses are about 90% covered in white mold, wrap them in a breathable cheese paper and continue to age them at 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 4 weeks. 6 weeks if you want a softer cheese. After that, you can store them in your regular refrigerator. It has been 4 long weeks since we made this cheese, and I have been waiting with great anticipation to cut into them. I'm having a party tomorrow night, so I want to see if these cheeses are okay to serve. I can already tell by touching the cheeses that the texture of this cheese is firmer and the texture of this cheese is softer. I think this one is a little bit riper than the big one. And there is that beautiful white coat that we made. What a gorgeous cheese. And the rind smells like mushrooms. Let's open this one. Another beautiful cheese. You can't see any evidence of the holes that we made when we pierced these cheeses. They've all been covered up by the white mold that we added. So which one should we cut into first? This one? Okay, I'll cut into the smaller one first. Look at that. Beautiful blue mold growing on the inside and a beautiful white mold on the outside. And let's cut into the larger cheese too. We have some blue mold growing on the inside, which is what we wanted. I might want a little bit more blue mold on the inside on my next batch, but sometimes it depends on where you cut it. So let's cut it a few other places. Now this piece is a little bit better. Look at that. Just the right amount of blue mold. I'll have a taste of the small one. Oh, it's nice and soft. Look at that beautiful piece of art. If I let this cheese age a few more weeks, the inside will become more soft, more gooey. That is amazing. I don't think I have ever tasted a nicer Cambozola. The blue is not too strong. It's got just a hint of blue. I think you're really going to enjoy this cheese, making it, eating it, and serving it on a cheese board when you entertain. If you enjoyed this video, I do hope that you click the like button below and make sure to click on that subscribe button so you can see my videos about cheese making at home in the future. I'm Marianne for Give Cheese a Chance. Happy cheese making!